Now I have the honor of introducing my colleague, Joe Kopta. And on a personal note, I'll just say Joe was a student, then he was an assistant in Venice, and now he has been a colleague taking the place of our former colleague, Dimitri Hauzakostas, whom I hoped to get here today, but I didn't succeed. And he's been a real major player in Venice for the last 8 years. So Joe Kopta, a Pratt and Venice alumnus from 2007, served as on-site assistant for 3 years and has been a faculty member of Pratt and Venice since 2015. He earned his BFA/MS in Theory, Criticism, and History of Art, Design, and Architecture from Pratt Institute in 2010. Joe's focus as an art historian is the art and architecture of the medieval Mediterranean. His research and teaching are informed by issues of materiality, cross-cultural interaction, and networks between Venice, Byzantium, and the Caliphal courts, ideas which stemmed from his time as a Pratt and Venice participant. He is currently completing his PhD dissertation considering such matters present in Byzantine manuscripts. His degree will be from Temple University. And since September 2019, he has had the honor of being a Samuel Kress Institutional Fellow at the Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte in Munich, Germany. Joe has presented his work in multiple venues, and in 2018, he organized the Italian Art Society sponsored panel, Venice Materiality in the Byzantine World, in the International Congress on Medieval Art and Medieval Studies in Kalamazoo, Michigan. He has also worked in museums, the Aldrich Museum, the Museum of Biblical Art, and the Metropolitan, as well as teaching at Pratt. Joe Kopta, I'm delighted to introduce you. Joe will now share his screen. I just want to mention this part. Joe will now share his screen, and I want to invite people again to submit questions and comments via chat, which will be read by Fei Ku, our printmaking professor. Hi, Dorothy. Okay, Joe, go.
Thank you, Diana, for the kind introduction, which in many ways has me feeling very nostalgic for Venice. As you've expressed, I too was very disappointed to not be in the Serenissima this year, especially interacting with our longtime Venetian collaborators at the Università Internazionale dell'Arte, the Scuola Internazionale di Grafica, and the generous staff of the libraries at the Biblioteca Marciana and the Fondazione Cini. Yet, at the same time, I've been appreciative of the numerous ways in which we have celebrated the 35th anniversary of the program over the past year. We've been fortunate to host 2 exhibitions of our alumni's work, first in Venice and then in New York, to welcome our alumni back to the program and celebrate their many accomplishments. In this sense, I'm extremely grateful that this research symposium has been organized, as it demonstrates the great strength of Pratt and Venice under the leadership of Diana Gisolfi. The integration of the study of art and its practice in La Serenissima, and all of the rich conversations that blossom between artists and art historians. My colleague, Michael Brennan, has said about the program, the great gift of Pratt and Venice is that you go to Venice and then you take it home. Now, while the sentiment is perhaps as true for me as it is for all alumni of our program, I found myself not only taking Venice home, especially in this year of pandemic, but also returning often to it, first as a student, then as on-site program coordinator, and very gratefully, teaching art history since 2015. In this sense, I and other alumni of the program dance the delicate balance between visitors and honorary residents during our time in the Calli and Campi as we explore the Sestieri together, guests of the Venetians. In this way, as we study the art and architecture of this special place, we also come to consider our own identities as artists, researchers, students, stranieri, and ospiti. And it is from this perspective that I wish to consider a similar interlocutor in Venice, albeit one arriving under different circumstances, whose own identity and the way he articulated it between multiple cultures, Orthodox, Byzantine, Italian, Catholic, in turn informed the visual culture of Venice. I'm of course speaking about Basileos Bessarion, the 15th century Greek cleric, scholar, and philosopher who emigrated from Byzantium in its final years to Italy, integrating himself into Italian society, being named a Catholic cardinal, and widely understood as contributing through his scholarly activities and translation efforts of reviving Hellenism and Greek language scholarship in the Latin-speaking West. Among the places where his effort in Hellenic revival were most fruitful was, of course, the Republic of Venice. As an art historian of the Byzantines, those Greek-speaking peoples of the medieval Mediterranean and inheritors of the ancient Romans, I'm most comfortable thinking about the visual culture of the former Eastern Roman Empire, whose political borders no longer exist. Yet, Byzantinists find themselves in the position of benefiting from a wealth of material culture from the East in Venice, as a result of centuries of shifting exchange, trade, plunder, and gift-giving. One of these great treasures of Byzantine visual culture is, of course, the library that Bessarion famously donated to the Republic of Venice in 1468, which became the foundational collection of the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana, one of the cornerstone institutions of Venetian civic identity. The research that I'm currently undertaking for my in-progress dissertation, which investigates the materiality of Byzantine manuscripts in terms of genesis, dissemination, liturgical and monastic settings, and modes of production, has brought me to the collection of Bessarion's Byzantine books in Venice at the Marciana, which I've been pleased to share with Pratt and Venice participants in various ways. Delving into the earlier medieval world of these manuscripts and reconstructing their meanings has fostered in me a curiosity about the patronage of their collector and the manner in which they arrived in Venice. For these Byzantine objects were not the spoils of war, as we see in the marbles stuck in the facade of the basilica across the Piazzetta, but rather a carefully considered gift of enormous value to both the Republic and the donor. As cultural historians of 15th century Italy have well articulated, Bessarion's role as a Neoplatonist and his reconciling of Platonic philosophy with the Aristotelian and scholastic traditions in the Latin West are as important as the actual donation of the luxury objects themselves. Bessarion was born in Trebizond on the Black Sea circa 1399, and at an early age traveled to the capital at Constantinople, becoming a monk in 1423 and serving as a diplomat for the Emperor John VIII Palaiologos. In subsequent years, he studied under the tutelage of Gemistos Plethon at Mistras, the Neoplatonic philosopher famous for reintroducing Plato to the Latin-speaking West during the Council of Ferrara, Florence in 1438-39. In 1437, Bessarion was made Metropolitan of Nicaea, after which he accompanied Emperor John VIII to Italy to attend the Council of Ferrara, with the intention of fostering communion between the Catholic and Orthodox churches in light of Byzantium's rapidly dissolving political borders, and at which the introduction of Platonic philosophy played a role. Although the council ultimately declared communion between Catholic and Orthodox churches, with Bessarion himself reading the Greek Church's declaration of unity with Rome in 1439, in practice, unification was ultimately unsuccessful. Yet Bessarion, a polyglot, had ingratiated himself into the papal court, and Pope Eugene IV invested him as a cardinal of the Catholic Church in December 1439, from which point he thereafter resided in Italy. In the wake of the final collapse of the Byzantine Empire as a result of the Ottoman taking of Constantinople in 1453, Bessarion's activities until his death included both the petitioning of Western Christian governments to aid in reconquest against the Turks and the preservation, as he saw it, of Hellenic culture, mostly in the form of the copying and recuperation of Greek texts. The donation of Bessarion's library and the means by which it arrived in Venice are almost semi-legendary, having been retold since his lifetime and relatively well considered by modern scholars, including Lotte Lebowski and Marino Zorzi. On a diplomatic trip to Venice in 1463, Bessarion was hosted by the Benedictine monks of San Giorgio Maggiore, the congregation across the Bacino from the Doge's palace, at which time he wrote his first will in which he promised his collection of Greek books to the monastic library. As Tracy Cooper has well articulated, these Greek books were much desired by the congregation, which in the early 15th century was engaged in the absorption of Hellenic culture. The relic of the head of the Byzantine saint, George, had arrived in Venice, and possessions in the Greek-speaking Venetian colonies of the Morea and in the Aegean were reaffirmed. Yet upon returning to Rome, it seems that Bessarion changed his mind, or perhaps was convinced by Paolo Morosini, the Venetian ambassador to the Holy See, that his collection would be better served as a gift to Venice's titular church of San Marco. We might understand the reasoning behind this change of heart when we read the 1467 bull of Pope Paul II, himself a Venetian, permitting Bessarion to cancel his earlier donation to the Benedictines on San Giorgio and instead direct his library to St. Mark. The justification for this change, articulated in the introduction, puts the deciding factor squarely on the shoulders of practicality, in which the bull states, "Having you, Bessarion, for many good observations, and especially since San Giorgio Maggiore is the same monastery on an island away from the one joined to the city, where one can only go by little boat, and for this, so it's easier, wanting to study or read or go to the same library, you, Bessarion, request that the aforementioned books be brought to you, and also many other Greek books obtained after the aforementioned donation, not only your Latin books, to the procurators of San Marco in the very church of St. Mark of the Venetians, to which one may go without a boat from said city, and where likely the same books can be preserved and kept safe more diligently." In other words, the island sanctuary, which had separated the Benedictine congregation from Venice proper since the 10th century, was seen as far too inconveniently located, accessible only by boat, to serve as a proper place for a library accessible to Venetians. Shifting the library instead to San Marco would accommodate greater entree to the books themselves. The subtext behind this change in donation was, of course, a calculated diplomatic strategy. Marino Zorzi has suggested that, as San Giorgio was under the aegis of the papacy in Rome, it could occur that part or all of the library be redirected elsewhere or otherwise restricted. We should not forget that Bessarion's activities in his later life were centered around the preservation and integration of Greek culture in Italy, and his personal library would be better served under the authority of the Venetian government. This switch to donation came at a time of increased interest in Venice in Hellenic learning. Private collections of Greek literature and art, notably that of the great patrician Grimani family, were rapidly being amassed. We should also remember that Bessarion actively petitioned the Venetian government for military aid in retaking Byzantium from the Ottomans. In this aim, Justin Greenlee has convinced me that the Stavrothiki, or relic of the True Cross, which Bessarion donated to the Scuola Grande della Carità, was not only a diplomatic gift fostering allegiance of Venetian military aid, which never in fact manifested, but also as a potential weapon of the Venetian Christians in crusade. The donation of the library was made official in a letter sent by Bessarion to Doge Cristoforo Moro and the Senate in 1468, although the first shipment of books did not arrive from Rome until the following year, accompanied by an inventory drawn up by Bessarion and his secretaries. The importance of Bessarion's library for classical and medieval Greek cultural history cannot be understated. Works of Greek theology, mathematics, music, astronomy, poetry, grammar, and rhetoric are included. Philosophy, Bessarion's personal forte, is well represented. In some instances, the only existing examples of certain texts from antiquity are contained in these manuscripts, such as the commentaries on Homer's Iliad in manuscripts Venetii A and B. As we know, the arrival of Bessarion's library in Venice, including Latin texts and incunables, would require most of a century from Bessarion's death in 1472 to find a home in Jacopo Sansovino's Biblioteca Marciana, during which time the books were kept in trunks in a closed-off space in the Doge's palace, with multiple conflicting inventories being drawn up and, quite shamefully, several books having been borrowed and never returned. As Lotte Lobowski has carefully studied, by the time of the reorganization and recataloguing of the library leading up to its initial installment in the Sansoviniana after 1559, the contents of the original gift were not entirely clear. Before I conclude, I'd like to pivot once more to Bessarion's activities as scholar. Art historians of Venice, when considering the library of Bessarion, historically have not reconciled these books as material culture with Bessarion's Neoplatonism, an aspect that has been left to historians of philosophy. We should not forget that Bessarion, a talented polyglot, was a translator from Greek to Latin of Plato, Dionysius the Areopagite, and Proclus, and actively employed translators in his household of Greek texts into Latin. Let us remember that Platonic philosophy was relatively new in Western Europe in the 15th century, due to a lack of translations of his work from Greek or Arabic into Latin. Instead, the Western theological tradition had, for the past several centuries, focused its attentions on the recovery of Aristotle in the 12th and 13th centuries, and Aristotelian reconciliation with Christian theology, notably by Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica. This scholasticism became the dominant intellectual trend in Western medieval theology, and the Christian reconciliation between Aristotle and patristics was the norm in the Roman Church by the time of Bessarion's arrival in Italy in the 15th century. As Eva del Sodato has demonstrated, Bessarion's magnum opus, the In Calumniatorum Platonis, or Against the Slanderer of Plato, was a direct response to his bitter rival, George of Trebizond's Aristotelian Comparatio Philosophorum Platonis et Aristotelis, which attacked Platonic philosophy. In the writing of Against the Slanderer of Plato, over the course of a decade, Bessarion broke with his mentor Gemistos Plethon, who argued that the philosophies of Aristotle and Plato were irreconcilable, particularly in concepts and conceptions of God. Instead, Bessarion, a Platonist, was, and here I quote Del Sodato, convinced of the utility of Platonism for Christianity. He strategically decided to insist on the fundamental harmony between the two philosophers, end quote. In this work, published in 1469 with reprinting by Aldo Manuzio in the early 16th century, and in his translations of Greek authors to Latin, Bessarion provided Latin reading audiences with Platonic ideas and texts, integrating them with the Western Aristotelian scholastic tradition. In future explorations of Bessarion's Byzantine books, I intend to further explore the Platonic underpinnings, both cultural and aesthetic, that arrived in Venice with this Greek emigre. To be clear, I don't mean to suggest a one-to-one relationship here between Neoplatonism and Venetian identity. It's unwarranted, as Bessarion did not, in his writings, directly comment on Platonic aesthetics, except for a passing reference in several letters to Theodore Gaza. Nor are there any marginal notes by Bessarion in the Fondo Antico that suggest direct consideration of his philosophical tendencies in relationship to the manuscripts he gifted to Venice. Indeed, it seems quite likely, as Marino Zorzi and others have suggested, that Bessarion's donation is best understood as diplomatic tool in rallying support from the Republic of Venice for the retaking of Byzantium under a Christian banner. In this way, Bessarion, through his donation, contributed to the construction of a Venetian identity tied to an ancient Hellenic past, where one hadn't previously existed. Bessarion's relationship with Venice was clearly different from that of Pratt and Venice. Our students do not arrive in the Serenissima intent on fostering crusade. Yet, in a small way, I like to think that while the city itself gifts us treasures beyond imagining, we too leave something of ourselves behind in the floating city. So to my colleague, Michael Brennan, I would say that, of course, the great gift of Venice is that you go there and then you take it home. And yet, there is good historical precedence that shows that sometimes you go to Venice and leave part of yourself there. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We have 5 minutes for questions. I think Faye is going to read some. If you don't have enough, I've got one, but go and take the ones from the chat.
So from Peter D. Stabler, thanks, Joe. Could you say a little more about how Bessarion was able to build such a significant library and to what extent his personal library overlapped with others in Constantinople?
Hi, Peter. Thank you. It's a great question. I should mention first that there is a terrific and masterful overview of the Marciana, the social history of the Marciana Library by Marino Zorzi for reference. It seems clear that a great deal of Bessarion's collection actually came upon his arrival in Italy. So he first arrives in Italy in the 1430s as a member of the Council of Florence-Ferrara, and was in constant contact with booksellers after his permanent settlement in Italy. Although it seems quite possible that the collection that he had already amassed when he was in Mistras studying under Plethon was imported into Venice at a later date. So essentially, we think of Bessarion as bringing Byzantine books with him from Italy, but in fact he was buying them a lot from booksellers in Italy.
Interesting.
So question number 2 is from Kim Sloan. Hi, Kim. Joe, did Bessarion have a relationship with the Florentine Neoplatonists?
Good question.
So I think, sorry, I think my connection is a little fuzzy. Hi, Kim. The short answer is yes, and the historian of philosophy, Eva del Sodato, has written quite extensively on Bessarion's connections and interactions with his contemporaries in Italy, of which he essentially interacts with all of them. So yes, he was very active in sort of the group of Neoplatonists present in Florence.
And a question from Sergio Morosini. What is the procedure for getting to see these rare books at the Marciana?
Well, in fact, some of our students have done so. And really, the first step is getting a library card. And the second step is going. In some cases, one needs to make an appointment in advance to make sure that the manuscript is able to be consulted, through which you send an email, which is listed on the Marchana's website. But oftentimes, I've found that I have been able to simply show up and request a book, and it might take a day or two. But first step is getting that library card.
Any other questions? And please submit it into the chat.
While we're waiting, I have a quick one. When Bessarion decided to give I loved what you read there, that quote. This was just a wonderful, detailed analysis of this whole thing. So I loved your talk. When he decided to give the books, not to the Benedictines, but to the city, I had imagined that one of the reasons was that because the Benedictine monastery of San Giorgio was part of a whole congregation of Benedictines, the Casinese congregation, that he would have been worried that the books would have been, as they normally were in a monastic library, traded around between other monasteries of the congregation, and therefore would not have remained in one place, and therefore he thought it was safer to give it to the city. And I think in the donation, he also said the city has to build a library. It took them almost 100 years to get started on that, but they finally did, and with some things missing. The second part of the question is that inventory that you mentioned of 1468, it doesn't exist?
I'll answer the first question, the second question first. It does exist. It is at the Marchana. And the aspect that's problematic with this inventory is that it is clear that Bessarion, who was living in Rome when he sent his first shipments of books to Venice, did not send all of them that he articulated in the inventory. Because in the donation, he stipulated that he was allowed to keep some for his own consultation until his death. So he didn't send, so in other words, everything that's in that inventory didn't all arrive.
Okay.
As to your first question, I think you're absolutely right. And I know that Tracy Cooper, who I see is here, has written about San Giorgio. And the fact that it was a confraternity, a mitre confraternity, of course, with especially with Santa Giustina in Padua. So in other words, yes, there was a real likelihood that the books could travel around and be swapped out.
Yeah, they were.
And I think there was another part of your question. Maybe I missed it.
That's okay. That's okay. That covered it. That was good. Thank you. And it's now 12:50, so it's time for me. And that was just wonderful. It's time for me to introduce Cynthia.